When looking for an historic site associated with abolitionist John Brown, it would seem to make the most sense to look near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, where his famous raid occurred on the federal arsenal. Or maybe even Kansas, where he joined the fight over the state's destiny as a slave or free state, famously called Bleeding Kansas. But upstate New York doesn't immediately come to mind. So why is there a state historic site for John Brown tucked away near a resort town in the Adirondacks? Unlike other locations significant for his large and often violent actions to oppose slavery, this was his home in the last decade of his life and the place where his family put him to rest. Through the interpretive exhibits here at the farm and gravesite, we learn what sparked Brown's abolitionist zeal, what drew him and his family to this remote and undeveloped part of the Adirondacks from Massachusetts, and how the plans evolved for his raid in Harper's Ferry. As a child, John Brown witnessed cruelty against black child slaves that began to mold his sense of the injustice of slavery. However, it was Timbuktu, Blacksville, and other communities like them in upstate New York that caused him to move his family to nearby North Elba, New York. A wealthy abolitionist named Gerrit Smith had set aside 120,000 acres, giving 3,000 black families around 40 acres each, which earned them, in the process, the right to vote. John Brown wanted to be part of this larger community. But John and Mary Brown's family had barely arrived before he was off to join his older sons in what became Bleeding Kansas and the fight against slavery. Mary would have to run the farm on her own in his absences. The house has been restored to its appearance when John and Mary and their several children and daughters-in-law were living here. When he did return, his plans were already being formed to take over the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry. With the weapons seized, he planned to arm freed slaves to begin the liberation of all enslaved people. His older sons, Watson, Oliver, and Owen, would join him and 18 other men to put the plan into action on October 16, 1859. The raid achieved none of its immediate aims. The arsenal was not captured. 11 were killed in the raid, and John Brown was tried and convicted 2 days later. He would be executed less than 8 weeks later in early December. Mary's sad task was to escort her husband's body back to their home in upstate New York from what was then Virginia. Years later, their sons' bodies and those of the other 10 killed in the raid were moved to this site and buried together. It was in the 1920s that the John Brown Memorial Association was formed, with annual pilgrimages to the grave to lay a wreath on the abolitionist's birthday each May. They were instrumental in seeing that the farm was preserved. By 1935, the group had commissioned and erected a statue of John Brown, befriending a black youth at the entrance to the farm site, honoring his efforts and those of his followers to end slavery. In 1971, the site became a historic site. While the John Brown Memorial Association is no longer, more recently another group, John Brown Lives, has taken up where they left off and added interpretive exhibits to the site. The Dream of Timbuktu is on display in the barn, describing the impact of this effort at resettlement and enfranchisement on those who took on the challenge and the abolitionist cause itself. While many black settlers were financially unable to work the land given, others stayed and succeeded. However, most of the towns created from the land grant did not survive. John Brown Lives also created this display of quotes from contemporary and historical Americans surrounding the gravesite, entitled "Americans Who Tell the Truth." This peaceful farm belies the turmoil that came from here over 150 years ago. It now helps those in our time understand a little better what drove this complicated man and how his legacy is about more than a failed raid a few years before the Civil War. Generations later, many look to his willingness to put all on the line for justice and honor that as his legacy.